It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, with worms crawling through the damp earth. And to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and yet so dependent on each other, in so complex a manner as to have been produced by laws acting around us. I chose this quote from Darwin's On the Origin of Species because of three things. Firstly, it shows Darwin's passion for nature. Nature was Darwin's inspiration. Secondly, it shows Darwin's deep understanding for ecology. And thirdly, it's a wonderful example of the interplay between the arts and science. This entangled mass of plants that Darwin frequently refers to throughout the voyage of the Beagle, in the Brazilian rainforest, and in Tierra del Fuego, this entangled bank he almost certainly got from John Milton's poetry, Paradise Lost. So Darwin used the arts, literature, to enable his scientific work to be more appealing to the general public. He wanted the general public to be able to understand his work. So it's particularly exciting today to welcome York Polyphony, who are going to interpret Darwin's work in another art form, in music. Now, music may have had a rather bigger role to Darwin than one may initially think. When he came back from the voyage of the Beagle, he needed to make a decision to marry or not to marry. And one of the things that really pushed his mind to get married was he hoped to have a wife who could play music. Darwin loved music. He even said it sent shivers up his spine when he listened to it. And his prayers were answered. He married Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin, and she was a fine musician. She was even had a few lessons from Chopin. The family, Darwin's, Emma and Charles, moved down to Kent. They lived in a beautiful rolling countryside. It was a very manicured landscape at that stage, very beautiful. And they lived in a large house. And in their drawing room, at the end, they had a grand piano, two portraits, one of Charles, one of Emma, from their wedding. And behind the piano, there were French windows, and in the summer, they would have thrown the doors open, and Emma's music would have wafted outside. The smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the smell and the sounds of music. And in the winter, there would have been a fire in the drawing room, and there would have been a crackle and a flicker of flames, and Darwin would have sat listening to Emma's beautiful piano playing. And of course, this was the very house in Kent that Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, this amazing book. He sat for 20 years collecting information for his theory of evolution by natural selection. His study was a few doors down the passage. He would have sat at his desk pondering away on these problems, and he would have heard Emma's music coming down the passageway. So music would have filled their house. And it's interesting to consider that while Emma was a fine musician, Charles, we think, was actually tone deaf. And so, of course, in his usual fashion, he used this information in order to look at inheritance. He looked at which children had inherited this musical skill and which had not. And he used this very important idea of inheritance. Without inheritance, evolution by natural selection doesn't work. So he used this information for one of his most important theories. And he used music for another very important theory as well. He says that musical prowess was part of sexual selection. And I've got a short reading here from The Descent of Man. I conclude that musical notes and rhythm were first acquired by the male or the female progenitors of mankind for the sake of charming the opposite sex. So we can see that music actually was important for Darwin's theory of inheritance, for natural selection, and also for sexual selection. Darwin also did experiments with music. In later life, he became very interested in earthworms. Of course, earthworms are incredibly important for how the soil works, for ecology. And he asked many questions about earthworms. For example, can they hear? And in Darwin fashion, he set up an experiment, and he had his wife Emma on the piano, he had his son Francis playing the bassoon, and he had his grandson Bernard playing the whistle. And they had a container of earthworms nearby, and they listened and watched to see what the reaction of all these different music types would have on the worms, and there was no reaction at all. So they concluded that earthworms must be deaf. And Darwin referred to these experiments as fool's experiments, and he actually said, I love fool's experiments, I'm doing them all the time. So it was with this in mind that when I read an advertisement from the Royal Horticultural Society, our highly esteemed society in the UK, they advertised for a voice that would make plants grow. And it was tomato plants, and I thought, well, I'm working on tomato plants. I was just finishing off my PhD. I thought, I volunteered, I put my hand up. And I went with my sons, and my youngest son read I think some book. He was 6 years old at the time that he was reading. And I decided, since it was 2009, I would honour Darwin, and I would read on the origin of species. So they recorded our voices, and then they put headphones around each pot plant, tomato plant, and they played our voices for several weeks at a time. And a couple of months later, I'd completely forgotten about this, I get this extraordinary phone call saying, you've got the voice of Weasley. And I was very, very surprised by this, but my tomato plant had apparently grown 1.6 centimetres taller than the rest. And now I'm wondering whether it was how I spoke, or whether it was what I said. Now, I wonder whether singing on the origin of species would be even more powerful for plants. So it's on that note that it's great pleasure to introduce York Polyphony and Gregory Brown for their interpretation of Charles Darwin's work, Missa Charles Darwin. Thank you.
That we understand